So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center on I guess what is a very rainy day, as we're discovering. I'm Gwen Young, and I'm the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative here at the Wilson Center. And we're doing this event, as your materials will tell you, in conjunction with Plan International and the Resilience and Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. So on behalf of all of us, what I like to call the crew, we welcome here today. For those of you who don't know, the goal of the Women in Public Service Project under the Global Women's Leadership Initiative is to ensure that by 2050, 50% of all leadership positions in government across the globe are held by women. So we have a very ambitious goal, and the women on stage today, and some of you in the audience as well, are all a part of this goal in demonstrating why women's leadership is important for governance, for stability, for security, and for economic development. So I would like to thank all of you for joining us, and I look forward to the discussion of how women are advancing security and stability in their countries, and especially countries as we have Colombia on here, and others that are impacted by high crime rates, non-state armed groups, terrorism, and war. So I will be sitting down and doing with the panel, but I would like to invite Tessie to come up to the stage and say a few remarks to get us all started. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen, and good afternoon, and welcome to all of you on this balmy and beautiful spring day that we have. Anyway, we're delighted to be partnered here with the Wilson Center in this important event, and I really want to welcome our panelists, Her Excellency Dr. Joyce Banda, Gabriela Boucher, and Robin Lerner. We've got a terrific panel, and you'll be hearing from them shortly. For PLAN, we're a child rights organization, and as some of you have heard me say, we for that reason, invest a lot in women's leadership. Because we cannot think of a better investment to ensure children's rights than be investing in women's leadership, women's empowerment. We've got a number of initiatives, including the Women Lead Initiative, to do that. And so this is an important topic for us. And when we talk about women's empowerment, very often we're really focused on the economics of it. And the economics of it is important, but today we're discussing an important dimension of that is not as often discussed, and that's the role of women and girls in creating the conditions for sustainable, peace and stability. And by the way, that is a precondition for sustainable economic growth. You can't be talking about, economic opportunities and growing those if you don't have, the fundamentals. And there is a lot that we know and not enough that we know about the role of women and girls in this area. I mean, there's some very intriguing and interesting research, including research by the Gates Foundation that found a very powerful link and found measures of gender inequality to be a precursor to armed conflict. If you look at the OECD index on gender discrimination, you look at the bottom 17 countries, 14 of those have been in some form of armed conflict for the last couple of years. Valerie Hudson's own research linking national women's security with national security. Maria Riley of Inclusive Security has found that, and has had some interesting and intriguing research around what the role of women is in creating those conditions. So we've got all of these correlations, but we don't always understand sort of what is underneath those correlations. But we do know that women are much more likely to be inclusive, that when you have women at the peace table, you're much more likely to be bringing together into dialogue disparate groups and get a different type of dialogue that you would have gotten otherwise. So really looking at this topic in depth, looking at this topic and going beyond a concern with just what's happening in the Middle East and just what's happening around sort of countering violent extremism is in my opinion, a very important aspect of what we hope to be doing today with these great panelists. So let me turn that over to Gwen again, and thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you, Tessie. And those are some great comments for the framing of this. So before we start, I'd like to introduce the panelists. You do have their bios in front of you, but in terms of sort of placing where the conversation is coming from is farthest to left is Robin Lerner, who's a senior advisor and counselor in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, and has spent time, I think you called yourself a peace person, sort of managing peace, and now we're in the stability and security, so we can talk about that dynamic slightly. Gabriela Buscher is the Executive Director of Plan International in Colombia, so welcome, just up from Bogota yesterday, where you said the weather is similar, right? So that's great. And the former president of Malawi and current Wilson Center and Center for Global Development Fellow, Joyce Banda. Welcome, Dr. Banda, we're happy to have you here. So just to start it off, typically we talk about how women are disproportionately affected by conflict, violence, and by security. There's a loss of livelihood, families are displaced, they often take on extra burdens during this. But it also is an opportunity that women have the advantage and the know-how and the opportunity to start leading us through not only the times of insecurity, but post that. So I'm gonna start with you, Robin, looking at high crime rates in the Northern Triangle, non-state armed groups in places like Nigeria and Somalia, Iraq and Afghanistan, the civil war in Syria. Why are women so well positioned to respond to and mitigate the impact of instability and insecurity?
Sure, well, thank you so much, Gwen, and it's really an honor to be on this panel with such esteemed experts. And you know, I'm well aware of the high level of proficiency in these issues in the audience that I'm looking at right now, and likely that's tuning in on the webcast. So I'm gonna try not to just talk about the things that we already know. And I think the benefit of having me here is that I can speak to the specific experiences I have had and also to what the State Department is doing. So if I can just take a minute and just sort of talk about how we're working toward this at the State Department and what I've seen. You know, I've been really lucky to work with women in many different contexts and work on issues related to women's security and stability. And I think it's taught me that in post-conflict, you know, where things are very raw, you really see lessons firsthand, or maybe more extreme, you learn more extreme lessons that you actually can apply to every kind of context. When we talk about leadership for women, which I think this is sort of the central issue here that we're talking about today, is that we have to kind of realize that leadership doesn't have a specific face or a specific level, especially in post-conflict and transitioning societies. And I think it really, for women in these situations, long-term survival and prosperity is at the center of what they're trying to achieve for themselves and their families and their communities. So if we understand that, then we can understand what kind of leadership we might be looking at from them and trying to help them achieve in their communities. And as you said, there's an increasing amount of research that we've seen that talks about where women are absent, right? C-suites, peacekeeping operations, in parliaments around the world. But I would like us to step back and look at what we know women are doing and where they are in terms of adapting to changing environments around them. And this is so important in the peacekeeping, peace-building, post-conflict stages. I was in Croatia in the 90s and I was in Kosovo in the 2000s, and I watched women go from being the face of sexual violence in conflict to the new civil society, right? To the new economic drivers for their families, to the communicators between the international community and their own populations, and really the glue that held it together because of their ability to adapt. I have an ability to adapt. People, I'm sure all of us on stage have a good ability to adapt, and maybe that's female, maybe it's not, but I will say that the women I've worked with, it's been their ability to sort of say, what do I need to do to survive and ensure that my family prospers in the long term? That's driving my decisions. So we tend to, you know, we've looked at women as victims for a long time and we've turned a corner. And even back in the 90s, we started to eke out a place for women in formal positions of leadership. But for example, when the quota emerged in Kosovo for parliament, far fewer women were really willing to step forward. And for some that was a letdown, but for others it's sort of, we said, of course, there's so much going on in these women's lives, so we need to understand what they're trying to get to in their society so that they can be part of bringing stability to the society. So there's a lot we need to discuss about the right tools. And at the State Department, the kind of tools we're trying to equip the women that we work with and kind of with policymakers around the world, we have 4 key policy priorities, which is women in peace and security, women's economic empowerment, combating and preventing gender-based violence, and ensuring adolescent girls are empowered. And those issues are so intertwined. So if we look at, obviously gender equality, we all have seen the stats. We can quote the same quotes about, a barometer of insecurity is how women are treated or the kind of rights women do or don't have in their society. So I don't have to go into that. But knowing that these things are interrelated and we have to address them as such, when we think about countering violent extremism, and when you talk about these places of conflict, what do we want to see women able to do to create stability for their societies, and what do we recognize them doing? So we need to be where they are. So if women are providing refuge, if women have their pulse on their own family, right? They're able to influence the decisions of their family members. We probably want to take the cues from them and have ways of our policymakers being in tune with women that are in those societies and take cues from them. Not necessarily telling them what to do, but learning to take cues from them. And the way that we can help allow women to have that voice is by doing the work that we do in policy to help communities grapple with discriminatory laws, right? Help law enforcement grapple with how to do policing in a way that's gender responsive and equitable. And President Banda can speak to those issues, from being a decision maker in a country, but we need to think about how to be supportive, but we also need to always remember in a society that's facing conflict and we're asking to make changes is to think about what is the value proposition for that community by changing. And I think that I'm going to leave it there for now, but we really face, trying to help our policymakers work through our embassies on the ground, trying to communicate how to steer a community or how to steer the legal system. We've got to start with how do we make that make sense for the people who are going to be affected by that. So I think that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about value propositions and getting over the zero-sum game mentality.
And part of it, I think, too, is looking at, often in times of conflict, you will make assumptions, but actually really looking at what's going on the ground and who is making decisions in the absence of, at times, sort of formal decision-making powers and who makes the decision, which is sort of a nice transition to turn over to Gabriela. I mean, Colombia is coming out of a major conflict. As a part of the team that negotiated the peace deal, we had women at the table, for lack of a better phrase, right? The table they were there at the table, but I'd also like for you to talk about sort of what's happening also in civil society and recognizing where women have been in civil society and where they're going. As Robin so nicely set up, going from sort of the voice of the victim to this is the civil society that you're dealing with. Yes. Gabriela.
Well, thank you. Yes, Colombia is coming out of an important negotiation with with the largest illegal armed group, and it's the peace process, but at the same time there are many other illegal armed groups still in the country. So it's a complex situation, but it's definitely a turning page in the country to now have been able to go through this negotiation, and that the actual peace deal is very much recognizing women as leaders of the reconstruction and the specific requirements of women in this new phase, and the fact that the majority of the victims have been women and children. 78% of the IDPs, of the almost 6 billion IDPs, have been women and children. So that's an important aspect, and in fact, that was recognized by many different experts in peace and security. However, for the 3 women to have been in the negotiating table was not something that was thought from the beginning. In fact, the convening of the negotiation table, it was basically from the government side all men, and from the FARC guerrilla side 1 woman who's a Dutch guerrilla member. And so that started in that way. And in fact, it was more the very strong civil society women's groups who have been working on very different initiatives of peace building in different parts of the country that had a strategy of convening a national conference on issues of women and peace building, and from there made specific propositions for the peace negotiators, and one of them being really to put pressure to have women at the table. And they were not only at the main negotiating table, but also a special gender subcommission was created. And that is very important in many different ways. It's symbolically very important. And also some of those specific requirements of women probably were more focused on thanks to their presence. But also it's very important that it's linked to that grassroots movement that was very active all along. As planned, we are very much on the ground and in Colombia for 55 years. So we started in Colombia in 1962, and the conflict currently was declared in 1964. So we've been there all along this period of conflict with communities, with groups working on community development and really basically on resilience, and seeing what the particular role of children, which is part of what PLAN really focuses on, boys and girls and young women, what their role is in this community leadership that can bring about peaceful solutions. So a specific image that I have that gives a concrete example of what it can be like is recently we are working on developing a park in one of the most affected municipalities in the country. It's called Tumaco in the southwest of Colombia, where the great majority of the population is internally displaced and suffers from a range of different difficulties, including all illegal armed actors are there in one form or the other. So we were speaking to the children about what could be included in this park that was going to be a symbol of reconciliation and coming together now after the peace process. And the different groups presented. And then one of the girls presented what her group had come up with, and she said, we're going to make this the park of emotions. So I immediately connected with that because it's completely different thing from what you see normally in a park, a public park or a main square. You have the statue of normally actually a warrior. So that's what we value traditionally in all our different societies, whether it's a war-torn area or not. This is the narrative we're giving to people, is that's what's important, and that you put on a pedestal. Normally it's a man on a horse. And here she was saying, what about in the middle we could have a place where we can all have talk, especially talk with our parents, have dialogue in the middle. That will be the center. And then we have possibilities of expressing our different emotions, and anger or fear or love, and that would be really transformative. And that really comes from the view of a young girl and her group, of how you could really have a different way of interaction. And it wouldn't be possible if one doesn't listen to her and you don't work with her on making it a reality. So I think in many ways that is transformative, and the power of emotions, and how in a conflict environment they tend to be more restricted, and especially men's emotions, and when their masculinity is linked to violence and there's other emotions are suppressed. So what the possibility is for what has been more traditionally associated with the feminine, of expressing and emotions, can bring to a community dynamic. So an example from our community work, which I hope we can then expand to many squares across the world.
I love that, because you've got that idea of, I'm a lawyer, so there's that sort of restorative justice or reconciliation piece that's in that. There's the next generation, right? And then there's dialogue, emotion, and talking about different points of view, which I think is very important. You both have mentioned civil society in a variety of ways, and I'd like to turn to Dr. Banda, who does know a lot about the role civil society, and particularly the women's groups, will play in women's leadership and supporting women in asking for a change. I know in Rwanda and in Liberia, the importance of the civil society group in getting more women in parliament or getting more women elected. And I think from your experience and your work has really been driven a lot with those civil society groups. Dr. Banda.
Yeah, in Liberia, and they even tried to come to Malawi, but in Liberia, it was the women during the war, President Charles Taylor, towards the very end of his time, and the time that Ellen was running for office. It was civil society organizations that played a critical role in bringing about peace, and they even threatened to strip naked if people didn't stop fighting. And so the role of women in intervening cannot be overemphasized. But I also wanted to say that I come from a country like Malawi where we've never seen any conflict at all. I mean, if we have people protesting from morning to afternoon, that's a huge, huge demonstration. But then I discussed with my research assistant, we started to look at why is it that Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world, has enjoyed that kind of peace. And maybe we need to go and look again. We have what we call a matrilineal system of marriage. And in the whole Africa, it is only two places, Malawi and Ghana. And even in Malawi, it's 2/3 of the country. Land belongs to the women. Children upon divorce belong to the women. Now, the moment women control land, then they're in charge. So the men come and marry them. So you very rarely see people fighting over land. Disputes are not, because now it's poverty that causes conflict. And it's land that causes conflict. And it is resources, it is the lack of opportunity. Now, when women are in charge, when women control the land, when the children belong to the women, when domestic violence is minimal, because if this man is going to come and live in my village where I am with my sisters and my aunties and my mother, the last thing he wants to try is to abuse me. So it's in a place where all these are absent, you find that there's more tranquility and there's more peace, and women are able to operate freely. And I live in a country where I'm able to see both. And perhaps we need to go and check and see what role the power in the hands of women has played in avoiding conflict in Malawi.
Conflict.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'd like to stick with you for a second because you've had some really good policy recommendations around women's leadership, and also focusing on the girls, but interacting with local leaders, changing political will. Do you want to talk a bit about those? And I know when you were in office on a separate issue, you did enact some anti-domestic violence work. So why don't we talk a bit about the role policy plays? And I think Robin started off with really trying to change some of those policies.
Yeah, in looking at the question, which is question number 2, I looked at, I said what I said earlier, that poverty causes conflict. It's the lack of opportunity, lack of food, lack of resources, lack of opportunities that begin to cause conflict among the people. Women are the face of poverty. So, and then when conflict comes, women are the victims. What saddens me is that when people are running from their countries, if you see all that on CNN, you will not see anybody like me running. It's always the very poorest sector of the group, because people like me will always have flown out. We have the resources, we have the money. That is the tragedy. So that you're poor, at the end of the day, you're the worst victim in a situation of conflict. For me, the question is, these are the reasons why we must ensure that women are empowered. And then so we looked at, as Minister of Women and Children in my country, I looked at the violence against women and decided that I was going to do something about the situation. But it was at a time when men didn't want to hear that women are being protected. That hence domestic violence. I would have called it gender-based violence or women's rights. But I thought that I would woodwink the men if I said domestic violence means it's all inclusive. It's men, servants in that house, the children, the girls, and the boys as well. So I started to highlight incidences of violence in order to convince the public about what was going on. And allow me to just give you 2 or 3 examples of how far the violence can go. In one incident, a woman didn't want her husband anymore because of abuse. And she put her foot down that I don't want to go back. The man went to the village and tried to plead with her. She refused. And he went and hid by the river. And when she went to draw water, chopped off both her arms. And she was 1 month pregnant. So now she has a baby, but she has no arms. And I made sure that the whole nation knows. It was highly, highly publicized. Another woman, her husband told her to cook beans. And she didn't. And he came back, there was no beans. There was the wild vegetables, because that's all she could find. And he scooped out her eye. The third woman, he came to my office crying that she wanted a baby, but her husband couldn't allow her. Not that she didn't conceive, but she was pushing in long roads, steel roads like this to abort her babies. So she had lost 3 babies at that point. And I made sure that all these, I made sure that they are arrested. Yeah. Yep. But the one that caused me to do this, the last 2, was one girl that came to my office and said, I want you to send me to school. And I said, why are you not in school? And she said, my mommy went away because my youngest sibling has epilepsy. So she went to the village 8 hours away to live there for 6 months. In the meantime, my daddy came in my bedroom and said he was looking for money. And I got up to try to assist him, and my father said, no, you don't understand, the money is you. I need to sleep with you in order for my business to do well. That's what the witch doctors told me. And for the whole entire time the mother was away, this child was sexually abused by her father. He told her that it had been an agreement with the mother. The mother came back. The child says, Mommy, how could you allow this to happen to me? Mother says, I don't know what you're talking about. Ended up going to the church to report. The church said, well, you don't repeat this to anybody else, because that's what is happening to all women. And so the child came to me and I said, can you say this on public television? And she agreed, and we went and collected her mother to be interviewed as well. The whole nation of Malawi became clearly aware. I established what I call the one-stop destination, where women can run to when they are being abused. When I got there to launch this place, I found a woman and a man with an 18-month-old baby. I asked, I thought it was husband and wife. The man said, no, I'm her neighbor. I heard this child cry for a year, and I broke into the house and found her husband sleeping with this 18-month-old baby, because a witch doctor had told him that if he sleeps with a toddler, he'll be cleansed of HIV virus. And so I went to the police, and he's been arrested. I asked the wife how she could have sat around and tolerated that. The wife said, I don't have an income myself, so I didn't have a choice. So for me, it became very clear about the stubborn link between economic empowerment and social empowerment. That you can become, you can have power at household level, you can gain respect, you can make decisions about your life, you can control your income, you can provide better health, better food, education for your girl child, if you're economically empowered. But the key also for economic empowerment of women is the fact that it is also a stubborn link between economic empowerment and leadership. I started in 1997 an organization called the National Association of Business Women. And 5 of us from that organization went on to become members of parliament, ministers of women and children, and I ended up in State House. So there's no way we can ignore that. And so economically empowering women has that connection. What else do we need to do as nations? It's legal reform, laws that protect the woman and child. And finally, I think most importantly, what others have said is to ensure that we are building women leaders, because women leaders will, as far as possible, avoid conflict, including even with neighboring countries. In my case, if I was a man, we could have gone to war with our neighbor, because there's a land dispute that is going on even now. But when you're a woman, you find other ways of solving such problems and of coming to agreement even in difficult situations.
Robin, you were talking about some of the policy recommendations in promoting women leadership. Let's go into that a bit more. What would be some specific recommendations?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen the difficulty in sort of getting airspace for issues that, like right now, our policies are driven differently at different times, right? And so we're consistently trying to talk about empowering women as a solution to other problems. And it's really important that we continue to anchor in not a single issue approach, but what are we trying to accomplish and how can engagement with women get us there? And we do this, we have our strategies, as I mentioned, and we now it's really important to show how those interrelated strategies are going to get us to areas of peace and security, or the solution of other problems that might not be about national security. But I have a few examples of, for example, during Ebola, during the Ebola crisis, we saw, and everybody here knows, that women were disproportionately affected by the Ebola crisis, right? Because they're caregivers and working in the health sector. And so we could look at that women as sort of disproportionately the victim of that disease. But at the same time, because women were there so much, they could be the communicators once again to the community about the harmful effects and how to mitigate the transference of Ebola, and that was happening. And U.S. government responses were including kind of how do we empower women at these very grassroots level to mitigate. We also looked at we do a lot of people-to-people diplomacy at the State Department, and we have a big focus on empowering civil society leaders. They come on something called the International Visitor Leadership Program. We have a number of really effective public diplomacy tools. Other ones we also have other programs that build up young leaders, like the Young African Leaders Initiative. We have a lot of initiatives like that. And we often look at how do we tap into the alumni of these exchange groups, these exchange programs, to build approaches back into their local communities. And you'll see a lot of alumni groups looking at women and girls empowerment. Young people are naturally gravitating toward finding new voices of power. And a lot of them are women and girls themselves, or young women. And there's a lot of turning back and looking at young girls and mentoring, and looking at their own responsibility in creating the next generation of leadership, which is really great. And this, a sort of a group of our alumni self-motivated to, again, during the Ebola crisis, to create a system of communication. They kind of got together and had an idea of how they could get communication out to the affected communities, because as they saw, there was simply a lack of real information going to communities about Ebola, and they were like, we can do something about this. And their experience in the United States actually helped motivate them to go to the next level. So when I was working in the Balkans, again, I guess what I saw that was so important, and in terms of what we were choosing to push in a transitional administration for women, was, we were constantly walking into these communities and saying, okay, we have to end domestic violence now, and this is how we have to end domestic violence, right? We have to institute, temporary restraining orders and procedural solutions, and we have to make automatic prosecution for any instance of, domestic violence in the home. And we start pushing this stuff, and all these women's groups, I remember one day, these women's groups came, and they said during one of these, we would have these weekly or bi-weekly meetings, and they said, do not proceed with that. That is not what we need. Now, in some communities, that might be what they needed, but then and there, at that time, they did not need their children's fathers being, sent to jail. They wanted other solutions for this, right? And our policy needs to, again, flip things around and look at what solutions are we driving toward for problems. And it's almost like we have to change our habit loop, right? Because we walk in, we assess, we're like, this is what we've done in our countries, okay, this is what we're gonna do there, and let's go. And sometimes it's an afterthought to sort of ask the people. It's almost more complicated. And this happens, I think, and I'd be interested in what you think, Gabrielle, because I think in the peace negotiation context, it slows things down to be more inclusive, right? It does slow it down, but in the long term, it makes it more sustainable. But the same thing happens when we're developing policy. And as a lawyer, you know, sometimes our clients are the last ones we really consult with on our strategies.
We know better, right?
Right. Because we come up with the strategy and we want to get it done. But really, we have to slow it down and create new habit loops for our policymakers to see the reward in a new type of action. And I think we're all kind of struggling with how to effectively advocate for that and show best practices. In the peace negotiations, we do have some studies on that. Community policing, we've seen sort of women in the military be really effective at understanding more effectively what women in those communities need. Now our goal at the State Department is to help equip our policymakers, our diplomats, to be able to engage in these conversations
have
effectively.
those conversations.
Yeah, and to do so comfortably and effectively.
Because that loop often, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in international development, and the diplomatic crowd sits over here, and the development crowd sits over here, and sometimes the donor crowd sits over here, and then there's the community. And none of us are talking to each other, much less. Gabrielle, I want to turn to a different piece. And especially sort of coming out of this, that's that reintegration of women, not just as the victims, but women that were combatants and so forth. And some thoughts about what role, and how, that's a difficult process. But how that's in the thought of how that's going in Colombia and what that can do in terms of women's leadership and as well girls, and sort of seeing people get reintegrated back into society.
Well, as I was saying earlier, there are different types of illegal armed groups. So illegal armed groups that demobilized some years ago, more the right-wing paramilitary, had very small small composition of women in their ranks, whereas the FARC that are demobilizing now have up to 40% of women as combatants, and actually in some cases they achieved quite high status within the ranks, so more than perhaps on the average Colombian society. So it's a paradox that happens there, where they have experienced a different type of power relation than they would have in civilian life. And that's something to think of for their reintegration. And also to know that the majority of the boys and girls, or now FARC combatants as adults, were recruited as children. So the status as perpetrator or combatant, well, initially they were actually forcibly recruited themselves. And in many cases, when they decided for themselves to go to the armed group, it was related to domestic violence and to abuse. So they saw the possibility of joining the armed group as something of a liberation from a very difficult situation at home. So going back is a question, because what would they go back to? Or they would go forward to something different, possibly. In the case of child soldiers, who are still sort of part of the FARC movement at the moment, a great majority of the ones who have demobilized are girls. And many of the girls have romantic relationships with other men in the group who are much older than they are. And so there also another question about that power relationship. And many of them now pregnant, the very young ones, but also many of the combatants who are now grouped in the special areas of the country, ready to turn on in their weapons and to start with all the reintegration path, have decided to have children, which was an impossibility as combatants in the group. So that's another of the complexities. So although they might have felt liberated from the domestic violence originally, which they fled from, when they came to the guerrilla group, there was strong control over their reproductive health and rights, and forced contraception and abortions. Multiple abortions in some cases. So all those aspects need to be addressed in terms of psychosocial work. And then the whole aspect of reintegration to civilian life, the Colombian system, the Agency for Reintegration of Combatants, that's been working for many years, has actually worked with 30,000 people who have reintegrated into society. The great majority have been men. So only 16% have been women. And there is a disparity between the amount of, even within that percentage, the 16% have had less access to economic empowerment opportunities. So that's something to strengthen now in the strategy, considering that now in this new group there are much larger amounts of women. So there is a gender equality policy by the Reintegration Agency, which now needs to be strengthened, both for the younger girls, because to understand that they're actually a majority, and that in the adult group, it requires also that probably women have been affected differently or more affected because of all these, the sexuality aspect of their participation. The other aspect is some of them are not visible at all because they maybe didn't carry a weapon. So they may not have been counted and they could be excluded from the whole process. So there are many, many aspects to look into. and I think the main thing is actually that is from their side. Then there's the other side of the communities themselves, communities with whom we have worked for decades, who see the fact that we were there with them throughout all this period of conflict as something that really helped to strengthen their resilience. But now they ask for support in this part of reintegration because they need to receive with open arms, and they were actually very much for the peace accords and for the deal, but they still know it's very difficult to really integrate into the community these people who left for many different reasons. So it's not only following the way it's structured at the moment from the government side is reintegrating the individual who was a combatant. But there is a community approach, which is what we would as plan emphasize. It's not that person that gets integrated, it's the whole community that would integrate them and really to understand this as a more holistic approach. So increasingly along the years of working with all these conflict-affected communities and our role as plan in that country, in Colombia, is to understand the violence or the conflict is like the tip of the iceberg of many dynamics that are going on in communities of exclusion, ethnic exclusion, very unequal power relationships in terms of gender, and the inequality in terms of economic access and opportunities, lack of presence of the state. So those structural difficulties and the cultural difficulties in terms of gender inequality and discrimination have to be addressed as primarily before many other things are done. And it's difficult to show how that can be done, but we have very concrete examples, and actually next week we're going to present our community approach to peace building as a good practice within the Global Compact in Colombia. So it's community approach led by children and women's groups, showing how it can be summarized as democratic dynamics at the local level. Okay. So that these leadership capabilities are developed and they develop a common narrative about what is happening and bringing the community together. And we hope that this can be replicated in many other parts of the country to really build this peace from the community side and not thinking of the individual again, which would not help bring this coalescence that is required.
No, going back to Robin's point about also listening to the communities and what's going on, and I like the piece of thinking about the children and their integration in the next generation. And so there's a lot that we've talked about in this space, and as Robin said, I think we have a dynamic audience who knows a lot about this, so I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Please identify yourself, and also, as we say at Wilson, please ask a question. If I don't hear an inflection in the voice or a question mark, we'll simply move on to the next speech. But we would very much prefer the questions, and we'll probably take 2 or 3 at a time so that that'll give people a chance to sort of interact with each other right in between the questions. We've got a young woman back here.
Hi, I'm Christy Edwards. I'm the Director of International Humanitarian Law at the American Red Cross. And I was curious, as I'm sure this panel is very well aware, as women increasingly take on leadership roles in armed conflict, and certainly aren't the civilians that typically are thought of, I'm curious as to any of your perspectives on what the changing roles in women's leadership in armed conflict that you're seeing, if that's changing the nature of conflict at all, what opportunities you might see for how women can potentially bring about peace more quickly, if you think that that's relevant. Thanks.
Okay, great. And we've got a woman down here and then a woman in the red here, and then I'll come to that side of the room. So, go ahead. You need the microphone.
Hi, I'm Nora O'Connell from Save the Children. And first want to thank the panelists for a very interesting and provocative discussion. So that was a comment. But my question, yeah, sorry. But my question is, this has been an area where there's been a lot of evidence for a while. And do you feel like the progress in bringing women to the peace table, both from kind of the donor perspective and international brokers and at the national level, do you feel like it's where it should be, or do you think there's a lag in where it should be? And if there is a lag, what do you think could accelerate progress?
Great. So the donor perspective on where and how we're looking at this.
Hi, I'm Maggie Jeffries. I'm with Women Thrive Alliance. And we heard a lot about the civil society and their importance. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to, it seems to be this trend is sort of being talked about a lot right now of a shrinking space for civil society. And considering how you've talked about how important they are, especially in getting women and girls and grassroots voices to these different spaces, like maybe speak to that of like how can we move forward if that space is shrinking?
So I'm going to combine those as we figure out who wants to start answering first. We've got the changing role of women leaders in armed conflict. We've got sort of how the donors are looking at that, which in some ways linked to whether or not we're listening to civil society or giving enough space to that voice. Robin, you're nodding over there, would suggest.
Well, do you feel like that's something from your experience in Colombia you want to
The
speak to?
shrinking space of civil
No,
society.
the women and I'm
the
happy.
women leaders, the
just
changing
women.
roles in conflict.
Well, they're all very good questions, but it's a challenge. I would say that, well, as we were saying, in Colombia, in spite of all the strong civil society movement in peace building, the women were not initially considered at the table. And now it's considered a peace deal that very much includes that perspective. But then actually when the peace deal went to the vote in the referendum, one of the key reasons for the no vote was to do with the aspect that it had included so much gender equality and the rights to different identities. So people, well, it was a bit manipulated, but many people concluded that these would change gender relationships so much that it was more of a threat than armed conflict. So in reality, there is so much, well, there seems to be so much fear of really changing some of this, the status quo of patriarchal society, which actually, as a consequence, brings about war, that there doesn't seem to be the causal, the understanding of the causal effect of one on the other. That if this extreme power differences between men and women or some of the LGBTI community that are even more excluded, that brings about more conflict. So I think there is a challenge to clarify those linkages and to show effective leadership that can bring about that change.
I mean, there's a half glass full and a half glass empty approach to that, like women in peace negotiations, right? And I feel like I take the half glass empty, glass half empty. And I was on a panel last week at USIP, and my co-panelist took the glass half full, and I felt really chagrined. But I think, you know, I mean, again, if women are included in order for transactional reasons, but not really because the post-conflict environment, they're expected to have a role, a significant role in the administration and in the actual governance, then it weakens the whole approach of including women. And so, again, I mean, in the societies that are seeing conflict, I mean, the equality factor is usually pretty low, and so to expect that during negotiations there would be some true transformation, and that would evolve into the post-conflict environment, or post-conflict period, is really kind of hard to believe. And so, again, we have to kind of get back to really what is the value proposition to everybody around the table. And you know, being in places like Kosovo and many places where sexual violence was so prevalent in the conflict, and then those same people became the leaders of the society, I mean, what does that just say to them? So we've obviously evolved since then. We have evolved. And 1325 is out there. We work a lot on, we have a national action plan. Many countries have national action plans. We are talking about that so much more. I mean, one of our 4 strategies is women, peace, and security. But because it takes so much to create the tapestry, right? To create that tapestry where a woman is willing to step forward and fight like crazy, like strip down naked just to like make the point. Why should she have to do that? So it's asking a lot of people who are disempowered to fight their way in. And so as international policymakers and as us as diplomats, we have to understand that value proposition from the beginning. But then it ends up, I think, the reason I go glass half empty is because it generally comes at a cost, right? It's like this or that, just like you laid out, this or that. In Afghanistan, it was so hard. It was like, first do peace, then we'll deal with the women. And if you throw down on women, then you're going to lose something else and you're going to lose people. And so, you know, we're just still at that place. So again, we have to start with, you know, I think Dr. Banda sort of, we've talked earlier about starting at the very community level to make sense to the people in that community as to, if I change, what will be better for me? If my, if my habit loop changes, what is better for me? And that takes a long time. And so I think we need to be not, obviously you all agree with this, but not waiting until the conflict happens. But I guess all in all, we're in a better place than we were before because we have the data. But I would also say that we have data that shows that more deaths are caused by domestic violence than by wars, right? But yet, it still happens all over the place, and sexual violence is becoming more and more popular in our popular culture. So we're still missing something.
No, and it's interesting, and I've actually worked for organizations that have said that domestic violence piece, we can't deal with it because that's social cultural. That's not our place as an international organization. But I know that we have evolved. I know in Colombia right now, not only is SGBV and rape a crime, but you cannot get amnesty for that.
Exactly.
Which is a step further than we've been since Yugoslavia and since Rwanda. Dr. Banda, perhaps this notion of shrinking space for civil society or enlarged space for civil society from where you sit. You work a lot with civil society.
Yeah, I'm a product of civil society myself. Yeah, so that's where I started from, and I think that's the difference between me and most leaders, and maybe that's why I didn't last, because I think our way of doing things, it's not power, it's not the power, it's the people. The people come first. And because you want to protect the people, you are going to rub on the wrong side of other people, and they will finish you, but they're powerful people. So if, in my case, I arrested 72 people for stealing, and they said, well, you don't arrest us, either we kill you or we bring you down. So it is the civil society in me, and I have noticed, and I said this 2 days ago when I was speaking in Addis Ababa, that there's this trend, I don't know whether it's only Africa or the whole developing world, where civil society organizations are looked upon with suspicion. In fact, in many places, they are actually treated like opposition parties. And they are the ones that are targeted, and they are the ones that are arrested, they are the ones that are beaten up, and sometimes they just give in. This government found a way of dealing with that. It was in 1987 to 1990. They brought to Malawi, and it was a project under the USAID that they called the Shared Project. And the Shared Project was looking for civil society organizations that had a good concept, a good idea. They could go to Shared Project for Institutional Development Fund, and Program Fund, and the capacity building. And in no time at all in Malawi, we found there were 200 organizations. And I am one of those. And there are times when they would be looking for me because government was just taken by surprise. They just didn't know what to do with all of us. And it's so naughty and talking freely and marching on the streets. And they came looking for me one time. I had to go and hide in the USAID. I don't know if Carol Pisler is here. I had to go and hide. Is she here? I had to go and hide in her office because they were looking for me. This is, for me, forging smart partnerships. It's not influencing anything on the ground. It is just providing that kind of support, that good ideas, determined people trying to provide checks and balances of their government are being abused, but sometimes when they see a foreign partner partnering with you, you are protected. And that's what is missing in most countries right now. They can't afford to run those indigenous organizations. And I am not trying to be offensive, but sometimes international NGOs come in, they don't have a clue, but they have a lot of resources. They get there, they do it wrong. 20 years later, they say, we came to Africa, we tried to help. We couldn't do it. These people just can't be assisted. But you didn't know what to do. And yet there were indigenous organizations, the small ones there, that could have partnered with you and do it better. So, and we find some that really respect the people that they work with on the ground. And I think I've worked with Plan International. I don't know if they're here. In Malawi, I've worked with them before. They come, they invite you, you sit down, you work together. And that's, I think for me, that's what we need. Because definitely NGOs are, and the existence of civil society in most countries is really under threat.
Absolutely. And I think it's really relevant to this issue of women's participation because they're generally participating from civil society, not from a position of authority or government. They're, from civil society.
There's often that argument that the leaders come out of civil society.
Yeah.
Training programs train you into government. So we're going on to this side of the room. We'll start here and this woman here, and then we'll go in the back.
Thank you. I'm Wade Channel from USAID, and I'm proud to hear that we gave you refuge. A question about how we move more women into places of power, or how more women can move into places. Your thoughts on quotas, whether it's at the peace negotiation table, in the parliament, or elsewhere, to the extent that you find that quotas are a good idea, who should be behind them? How should they be pushed?
Great, wonderful. And this woman right here?
Thank you. I'm Leslie Cosgrove. I'm with Amaranth Village, and we're currently working in Nigeria. And I'd like to repeat something that Dr. Banda has said, and basically forging indigenous community partnerships that are women-led and women-inclusive. And we are doing that there at the village levels. The issue is, though, developing tools that are SDG competitive, okay? We're confused. We'd like to begin to measure the work that we're doing, but we don't want to invent tools, all right? We're trying to find some that are out there, and we're looking for baseline surveys, any kind of initial tools like that, because we are building the partnerships. We have the networks. We're well into the Northeast territories and into the Delta region, and also now Lagos, where the militants, the other militants, are now rising up. And how do we... And I really related to Gabriella's issues in terms of child soldiers and women child soldiers and the Chinook girls that were taken, and we're still dealing with the issues of that. And how do we begin to measure, all right, the work that we're doing in terms of leadership and development? What basic tools are there out there? Thank you.
So it's tools about, and we're going to go back here. There's a woman, I think, back there. So about measuring the impact and measuring the progress we're making, if you will. Yes.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm Lindsay Hughes from Apt Associates. I'm a behavioral scientist, and so I have a question that might be difficult to answer. But you mentioned that, and this was very interesting, that the women who you're asking to kind of fight for their own empowerment, that's a huge ask of them. And I'm curious if you have seen any kind of commonalities among those women who do seem to stand up for themselves, if that's possible.
So we've got, as our last comments, we've got the quota question on the who pushes and how do you set them up, the measuring the impact, and then who do you find sort of coming to the table if you do create that space, whether it's through a quota or whether it's through USAID asking who comes to the table and what, is there a typology of that? You're all looking at me. Who
The type of women.
Yeah, that come up to and stand up to be the leaders. So we'll start with Gabriella in the middle then, because she just looked down to right from.
Okay, so I don't know what the right answer. I suppose it depends on the context about the quotas. I just know that probably in a place like Colombia, we are now below average in terms of female representation in Congress at around 20%. I think it's actually average worldwide, below average for Latin America, but average worldwide. And but where we are really low is mayors of of municipalities, it's only less than 10% are headed by women. And I think that's the place where it may be most impactful to have a woman leader more at that local level. The other figures are more remote for the average community person, and I really wonder how one could do that, because it's democratically elected leaders. But I think it just takes the longer process of starting on leadership development and strengthening and building self-esteem of girls from very early on, more than the quotas, because at that level one wouldn't be able to achieve it. And speaking to a congresswoman recently, she was saying how, well, she's there, she was elected, but she still feels she's very much in a male-dominated environment where she cannot actually act in the way she would. So she may be fulfilling that position, but very restricted in terms of what she would need to want to do. So it's more a wider transformation that is required, but I suppose quotas are a good step towards creating those role models that people can follow.
So I guess it sounds, I should retract, I think it was I that said we're asking a lot of people to step forward. And that's, I mean, that sounds terrible, because really many women want to step forward, and we need, you know, they're asking for support to do so. I mean, you can just look at young people in this country who might want to run and they just don't know how. And they don't even know where to start. And being politically active is, you know, where do you start? And am I the right person? And do I have the right skill set? And this, you know, who will support me? It's an endeavor that is risky, and will I make it there? So I guess I would like to say, having these programs that help individuals find their interest, and then how to do so, right? And it takes a lot of training to become prepared to be a public official. Now, when I say we're asking a lot of them, because I think in post-conflict environments where, you know, there's so much foisted on, especially women when there's widows, right? When men aren't coming home or men can't come home. And I saw this up close and personal in Croatia, where it was sort of old women coming home, and they had to fight to get their property back. And if they were lucky enough to get their property back, they had to fight to get them their land back. If they got their house back, they had to get the land to farm the land. And they had to find all of their documents, you know, and this stuff is really, really hard, even for the youngest, most, you know, energetic person. And so if we said to these women, and now we really want you to go and, like, you know, get on the city council. So you go, when am I going to do that, and how? So this is what I mean in sort of phased approaches, but there is a way to identify those that are ready to do it. You know, we don't have quotas in the United States, as you know, so we can't really advocate for that. But you know, I mean, there's obviously, it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is numbers, then that will get you numbers. If your goal is influence, it doesn't necessarily get you influence. And affirmative action programs, sometimes you see the woman is like at the very lowest possible. You know, we got smart enough to know that in Kosovo, I think they just had to be on the list. So they would find these, you know, 3 women to be at the very bottom of the list. And then it was like, nope, you got on the, then you got to be in the top 30% of the names, because it depends, you know, how far they go down the list to serve based on how much they won by. So we were like, we were onto the tactics. But if the goal is to force the issue to just start getting examples and start getting people in place and finding the women that are ready to go and giving them that support, then there is value to forcing the issue. But I love the programs that literally teach people how to speak, and to, you know, starting at a young age, the programs that train, which is really so smart. Yeah, I think we can leave it there.
I think Gabrielle had something to say, and then Dr. Bennett, I think you had one more comment on that.
To complement that leadership development, I think something that we are focusing much more on now as plan in Colombia is the domestic chores. So we measure in Colombia an average, a girl spends 18 hours a week in domestic chores vis-a-vis a boy who spends around 9 every week. And so the more we work on renegotiating those gender roles, it's first renegotiating peace deal, but then you need to really negotiate up to the most basic distribution of time inside the home. so that there is that possibility of it not being an extra additional burden only for women. And so if we can measure that actually, and there will be tools, and in fact in Colombia the government measures the use of so-called free time, which is in fact mostly dedicated to domestic chores. So then one can see if that time is liberated, then there is more possibility for women with the talent and the support to develop leadership skills to really run for office.
Yeah, to take that. Dr. Benda.
If I understood the question properly, the question was which type of women are coming forward to stand for elections, and I think as far as Africa is concerned, first and foremost is education. They must get educated. But we have found that those that are very highly educated, professional women, are shying away from elected office. And I think it's because of the abuse that goes about during the elections, and these professional women are saying, I'm not going to give up my career as a doctor to go and be abused like that. So it's the next level of women. But in a place like Africa, where 80% of are rural-based, so everybody is encouraged to go and stand where they came from. You can't just decide, I'm going to stand here. When you come from Virginia, you have to go to Virginia. So if you haven't developed a relationship throughout your adult life with where your parents came from, from your roots, then you're not going to just turn up one day and say, I'm coming here to please vote for me. That's not possible. Yeah. So we encourage women as they're growing up, if you're considering a political office or elected office, have a relationship with where you came from. Once in a while, attend a funeral there, attend church service there.
Once in a while.
Sponsor 2-3 girls to go to school as you're growing up, as your resources get better. Put a borehole here. So by the time you go, in my case, it is the people that came to ask me, because by the time I went and stood for election, I had built schools and water in the community. I was doing that because that's where I was born. Thirdly, is to ensure that the women must have money. There's no way anybody is going to stand for office or to be elected if they don't have the resources. And I will forever be grateful to the government of Norway, because they're the ones who listen to us first. Because we went to them and said, it's not only training. We get so much of this training and this inappropriate training. Because the training that I need in Africa is not to tell me to be assertive, to look the people straight in the eye. That's the best way of losing an election in Africa. I have to look down and to kneel down because I'm talking to a chief. So it's not the training we need, it's the money. So the Norwegian embassy gave every candidate 100,000. And we went from 11 members of parliament to 27 to 45. So it can work. So it's training, it's resources, it's education, and the right type of education. And the women must be courageous and must be informed and must know their rights. And so the schools that I have built under the Joyce Banda Foundation, they learn from age 3, rights education. They must know that they can do anything they want in life. And so finally, what is emerging now is the media. The media is what is affecting the women, even if they want to stand for election. They are called this name and that name, and then by the time you are so demonized that by the time you go and stand for election, you can't win. So we're fighting back. We're trying to find those that are friendly, and that's the part that our donors can play, is also to train our media, because in my case, when I got into office, our place in the index was number 145 in as far as press freedom was concerned. And I decided that a free nation is one that prospers. I'm going to open up, people are going to be free to write, to do what? As a result of that, we moved from 145 to 79, and the whole world congratulated us. But the result of that is that the women paid the price, because anybody was free to write anything about a woman who is standing. And then people then, in a society that is so patriarchal, and in a society where women are still trying to find their way, no, I'm not going to vote for a woman that they're saying has done this, and you have no capacity even to go and defend yourself. So the media training and the economic empowerment.
So I think that is a great way to sum this up of how we're promoting leadership in promoting stability and security. So we talked a lot about political will. We talked a lot about being holistic, so looking at the economic factors, the social factors, just as much as the cultural. Civil society was throughout all this, involving civil society, stand where you're from, listen to the voices of civil society. And as Robin pointed out, making peace and security a part of the agenda, a part of the discussion points as you're going through all of this. So I thank you all for coming. I would like to thank our panelists for their great insight and stories and personal examples. And have a great afternoon. Thank you all.